I used to think the worst pain I'd ever feel was losing a child my husband never even knew about. I was wrong. The worst pain is when someone you trust in your darkest hour turns that trust into a weapon and calls it help. My name is Sophia. I'm 25, married just over a year to Mark, who has served in the military for 7 years. 3 months ago, he lost his closest friend to suicide, and the ground under us never fully stopped shaking. Mark carried guilt like a second uniform. I carried the fear that if I added one more painful thing to his shoulders, something in him would finally crack. Then, out of nowhere, two pink lines asked us to grow. We hadn't planned this. New job for me, long shift for him, finances that made sense only if we were careful. But at my first appointment, I saw a flicker on the screen. A small, stubborn heartbeat, and the world rearranged itself around a new center. I started to imagine a tiny box with baby shoes, a note that said, "Hi, Dad," and Mark's face when the heaviness in him met this impossible light. 2 days after my doctor said everything looked okay for so early, the bleeding started. The ER lights were cold and too bright. The words were clinical, well-meant, and devastating. "I'm so sorry." I lay there rehearsing how I would explain random tears on our next video call, and when his face filled my phone an hour later, I lied. I said I had a migraine. He believed me because he needed to. I let him because I didn't know how to make his hurt and mine share the same room. In the days after, grief was a quiet, suffocating weather. I worked, I slept, I cried in the shower so the sound would have somewhere to go. I decided I would tell him when I could hold my voice steady and hold him at the same time. That was the plan. It wasn't a good one. It's just the one I could bear. Mark's younger brother, Dan, lives in my city. He texted about an insurance question right when I was too wrung out to think. I said thank you. He brought soup. He drove me to a follow-up when I was too lightheaded to trust myself on the road. He never asked for the story. He just showed up. And in the absence of my husband's arms, I told myself the next best thing was family. I told myself I was lucky to be cared for. I didn't notice that care can have a shape, and sometimes that shape is a trap. The thing about hope is that it doesn't need much light. A text from my doctor that lab results were normal, a message from Mark, "Ate anything? Proud of you." A quiet morning when I woke up and didn't immediately cry. I started to picture telling him in person. I wanted his first memory of our baby to be his arms around me, not a frozen screen and a clock in a different time zone. Dan kept a gentle calendar for me without ever calling it that. He knew when the pharmacy was slow and which tech didn't make me retell my history. He'd show up with groceries, leave them on the counter, wipe his hands on a dish towel like a brother who lives in the next room. "You don't have to talk," he'd say. "Just sit. I'll do the driving." Grief is a fog. It blurs edges. It turns acts of service into proof. I told myself he was simply a good man doing the right thing while my husband did the hard thing somewhere far away. On one evening call, Mark said, "I hate that you're alone. I'm so grateful Dan's around. Tell him I owe him big." I nodded and swallowed a stone. Gratitude is a decent blanket in a cold room. It isn't a lock. There were little things that should have rung louder. The way Dan would say, "You shouldn't be alone, alone," as if the second word carried a different meaning. The way he praised my strength and in the next breath asked if I'd been sleeping in the bedroom or on the couch. Questions that sounded like care and were also maps. 9 days after the ER, Dan arrived with warm takeout from my favorite place and a look that read me like a checklist. Eaten? Barely. Rested? Not really. Safe? Probably. We sat. He talked about work, neighbors, anything that didn't require me to do the heavy lifting. You must feel so lonely without him, he said when there was nothing left on the table but napkins and silence. I gave a small, honest nod. At least I have you, I said, because gratitude felt like rent for the space he'd been holding. He said, yes, you have me. You shouldn't be alone. And the second alone landed like a step closer in a quiet house. I stood up to do the dishes I'd already decided could wait. The faucet ran. The plates were already clean. My hands shook anyway. Sometimes your body knows the next paragraph before your mind can read it. I didn't hear his footsteps so much as feel his breath near my neck, the way the air changed temperature behind me. Dan, I said, sharply, hoping the sound of his name would redraw the line he was about to cross. He answered softly, too softly. It's okay. You're grieving. People need comfort. And in that sentence, comfort left the room. I want to be careful with words here. Some sentences don't deserve to be painted in detail. Here is what I will say. He moved closer when I said stop. He treated my silence like permission and my stillness like agreement. I froze. That's not consent. It's fear doing what fear does when it's outmatched. I pushed him away and it worked. For a second, his face registered surprise. Not guilt, not horror, not even confusion, just the irritation of a plan interrupted. I slid to the floor, shaking. He stood over me and said things about grief, about being there for me, like he was reading from a card that made him the hero of this story. Then he left, and the lock clicked. And the kitchen I'd cooked in 100 times felt like a place I'd never be clean inside again. If you've never frozen, I hope you never do. It's not choosing. It's not agreeing. It's your body pulling the emergency brake when everything else in you is spinning. Later, in the quiet, the questions come like a swarm. Did I say no loud enough? Did I make it clear? Why did I let him in? Why didn't I see it? As if hindsight is a courtroom and you're both the defendant and the judge. The next morning, I threw away the leftovers. I stared at my car keys and couldn't touch them because my car smelled like his cologne. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and turned away and then did it again, like my house had grown invisible fences overnight. He sent 2 texts in separate days. Are you okay? And I'm here if you need anything. As if nothing had happened. As if naming it would make it real, and if he simply didn't, it would fold itself back into the fog. 10 days after the ER became my calendar's cruel anniversary, Mark called with good news. I got early leave, home tomorrow evening. His voice had sunlight in it. Mine had a tremor. That's wonderful, I said, and meant it and didn't. He said, Dan's been taking care of you. I'm so grateful. He told me you've been fragile. I'll make it up to you when I'm back. I felt the shape of a story forming without me. Grateful husband, helpful brother, sad wife. And I understood that saying anything now wouldn't just be telling the truth. It would be unmasking a lie that kept everyone comfortable. I hung up and made a list, because lists feel like handrails. Lock the doors. Save the texts. Write down dates and times. Take photos of the groceries with their receipts and the appointment reminder cards with his handwriting on the envelopes. Call my doctor and ask for a note about the miscarriage and my follow-ups. Not because I wanted a trial, because the future sometimes demands evidence so your own memory doesn't get argued out of the room. I told myself, you are not dirty, you are not broken, you are hurt, and hurt can be healed. And then I sat on the floor in the hallway and cried until there was nothing left to carry. When I could breathe without counting, I planned the conversation with my husband like I plan crossing a busy street. Look left, look right, look again. I wrote the words down because paper doesn't interrupt. I love you. 2 hard things happened while you were away. I had a miscarriage, and your brother crossed a boundary and ignored my stop. I'm safe now. I've documented what I can. I want your help deciding what we do next. I decided what I would and wouldn't answer. I would not defend freezing. I would not translate my fear into a language that made it sound reasonable to ignore. I would tell him what I needed: to change the locks, to set a boundary that Dan doesn't come to our home, to decide together whether to tell his parents and when, to consider a report, not because punishment would mend me, but because silence had already broken me once. I added one more thing: resources. Not links, just names I could say out loud without my voice breaking. An advocate hotline, a counselor's office, my doctor's name. Not because I had to prove I was doing the right steps, but because self-protection is a kind of love, too. That afternoon, Dan called. I didn't answer. A message followed. "Mark says he's home tomorrow. Want me to help you get the house ready? Some things are better kept between us. We're family, right?" I put my phone face down and let the quiet answer for me. Family is a word. Safety is a reality. Only one of them gets to decide who crosses my threshold. I slept poorly and still woke up with a steadier spine. I opened the windows, let the air in, changed the sheets. I folded the blanket that smelled like hospital and grief. I made tea and actually drank it. When the knock finally came, my body remembered joy, how it feels to run toward the person who is yours. I opened the door, and Mark's arms were around me, and all the sentences I'd practiced scattered like birds. He pulled back and searched my face. "Tell me what happened," he said simply, not as an interrogation, but as an invitation. I had worried he'd fill the silence with his own answers. Instead, he made room for mine. I told him. Not every detail, because detail doesn't equal truth. Enough. I used the words I'd practiced and stopped when I needed to breathe. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it with bright paint. He squeezed my hand when my voice thinned. When I finished, he put his head in his hands for a moment, and all I could think was that I had broken him after all. Then he looked up and said, "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I believe you. And he doesn't come near you again." In those 3 sentences, something in me stood back up. We talked about next steps, like people plan a small war and a small garden at the same time. Locks first, he said, and we did. Schedule, install, test. You choose how we tell my parents, he said, and I chose a written statement for later when I could bear the answers. Report, he asked. I said I didn't know. He said uncertainty was allowed and that we could talk to someone who would explain our options without taking them from us. We drew a map of our social circle and marked exits. We told a neighbor we trust that unexpected visitors weren't welcome. Mark texted his brother and said, in words that were not a request, that contact with me was over and any future communication would go through him. Dan replied with a performance of baffled concern and a line about misunderstandings. Mark didn't bite. That evening, I stood in the kitchen doorway and forced myself to walk in. I put the kettle on, I set 2 cups on the counter. My hands shook, but they were my hands in my kitchen, not a stranger's in the scene my brain replayed against my will. When the water boiled, I poured and breathed in steam like it was medicine. Mark came in and leaned on the doorframe, careful not to crowd me. "Proud of you," he said. Not like a coach, but like a witness. Later, when all the adrenaline had drained out, the doubts crept back in their old costumes. What if I should have told him about the pregnancy right away? What if kindness is supposed to be accepted no matter the source? What if telling the truth destroys more than it saves? I don't have perfect answers. I have this. Grief doesn't cancel consent. Family doesn't cancel boundaries. Silence doesn't keep peace. It just keeps score in secret. I won't tell you this made everything easy. It didn't. People we love do not always want the story that is true when the untrue one keeps their dinner quiet and their group text calm. But my husband chose me, and that choice turned the volume down on every other voice. If you are listening and your body recognizes parts of the story, I want you to hear me clearly. Freezing is not failing. Stop doesn't need to be shouted to be real. You don't owe anyone a performance of pain to earn belief. You are allowed to protect yourself first and narrate second. What should we do next? Mark asked. And for the first time in weeks, we felt like what it's supposed to, not a burden, but a promise. 6 months from now, I want to measure progress in boring ways. How often I sleep through the night, how little the kitchen enters my dreams, how many Saturdays go by where the heaviest thing I carry is a bag of groceries and not a memory. I don't need revenge to feel whole. I need safety and the right to call what happened by its right name without being asked to smile while I say it. I don't know yet what we'll tell Mark's parents. I don't know whether we'll make a formal report or keep the folder of evidence as insurance against the day someone calls my memory dramatic. I don't know if forgiveness is a place I'll ever visit. What I do know is that my house belongs to me again, my marriage belongs to the two of us, and my body belongs only to me. If you're here because someone crossed a line and you froze, you are not alone. You are not late. You are allowed to choose the next right thing for you, whether that is telling a partner, calling a counselor, changing a lock, or simply speaking the words out loud in an empty room where no one can argue with them. Sometimes power comes back in quiet pieces. Moral compass. Grief never negates consent. Family is a relationship, not a free pass. Silence may protect someone's image, but it does not protect your heart. Questions for you. If the person who crossed the line is family, what matters more? Preserving the image or restoring safety? Would you report first or talk to your partner first, and why? Where does healing start in your experience? Boundaries, truth, or time? If this story reached you, leave a comment. If you've walked a similar road and feel safe to share, your perspective might become someone else's handrail. And if you're grieving something you never got to announce, I see you. Your love for what could have been is real. Your boundaries now are too.